Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second Insights briefing on post-COVID-19 new normal. And today's session will be on government policies and services. My name is Ammar Qadi. I am the Associate Director of Business Excellence in DinarStandard. And before we start our session today, let me just share with you a brief introduction about ourselves. So let's start with a brief introduction about ourselves. DinarStandard is a growth strategy, research, and execution management firm that empowers organizations for profitable and responsible global impact. We specialize in global ethical and halal economy, government innovation, and social impact space. We lead original market intelligence across innovation and strategy, marketing, investment in fintech and public policy. We work with public and private sector clients to identify opportunities across the global emerging economies with extensive experience in the following segments: financial and investment firms, government agencies, food and agricultural sector, travel, tourism, and halal economy. Our clients represent some of the most and dynamic global corporates and innovative government entities across the world. We have a world-class global team that across more than 100 subject matter experts over 20 countries and industries ranging from healthcare, technology, manufacturing, food services, and logistics. I would like to share with you a quiz for today just to make sure you are engaged in our session, and just it's a kind of fun of introduction, fun to start with. So please, I do encourage all of you to participate. All right, let's see the results of our poll, and just like to make sure that we, I'm sorry, there was some technical issue with the poll. Can you please just like re-vote again with the poll now, the quiz, and just like, let's see the answers. Okay, so this is some interesting results to the quiz today. So let's see how this will come up during our session today. So for today's session, I would like to introduce our CEO and Managing Director, Mr. Rafuddin Shiko, who will be guiding you through this interesting briefing. I would like also to introduce our respective presenters, Dr. Syed Farouk, who is the Future Foresight Advisor of Dubai Government, and Ms. Nahla Misbah, who she is the Senior Consultant at DinarStandard. Rafuddin, to you.
Thank you, Ammar. And thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to have all of you on. Appreciate the time. I will share my screen now, and we can get started. Ammar, if you can just confirm that we're able to see the screen. All right. Great. Thank you, everyone. Again, as Ammar said, we are excited to share with you our findings from our insights brief focused on government policy and function, where we have evaluated the major impact governments are facing, and out of which present to you our analysis of what we believe are the 15 signals of post-COVID new normal for governments. What are the areas for governments to focus? Before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge the team that has worked on this insights brief. We're honored to have Dr. Syed Farouk as a resident advisor, an expert advisor with us on this very particular insights brief topic. My colleague Nahla Misbah, who has led the analysis, and our senior associate Iman Kovales, who have led the research along with myself. So with that, I'd like to begin with the purpose of our brief. So as we all know, that governments are immersed in a crisis management mode in addressing this COVID-19 challenge. And certainly a strategic question many are asking is, what will the post-COVID-19 new normal look like? And for us, it's really from the point of view of how can governments not only survive, but thrive. And so this is the focus, and our target audiences for which we are presenting this are government policymakers, administrators, and advisors. A little bit about our approach. So this briefing is not looking at the immediate crisis response, but is focused squarely on post-COVID-19 scenarios. Our assumption on the timing of a post-COVID-19 environment globally is around summer or fall of 2021, and is based on the majority of health experts' views of realizing an effective vaccine deployment or major populations reaching sufficient immunity. And so as such, our new normal time frame that we're going to be sharing with you is 1 to 3 years, meaning 1 to 3 years as the inshallah, God willing, this COVID goes away. The way our presentation is structured is we're going to first start off very quickly with sharing a pre-COVID-19 baseline for governments. Obviously, the world is quite big, diverse. Governments are of different sizes, nature, challenges. So I think we believe it's important to have that context before we share with you next the current impact, because obviously the current impact of the crisis is creating new areas of opportunities, new areas of focus, from which we will present to you our signals that we have identified from these trends we see today that will stick as areas for governments to focus on in the future. And then led by Dr. Syed, we will share with you an action plan for governments. So that's a little bit of our structure. Now I'd like to invite my colleague Nahla Mesbah, who is sitting in Cairo and will be sharing with us the beginning context part.
Hello. To start with, we need to provide a context. What was the situation before the pandemic? As we said, we need to provide a baseline and to look at government functions and priorities before the COVID-19 struck. We have more than 190 governments around the world governing about 7.8 billion people. Government functions are organized in a specific way. And as you can see from the graph down there, that governments around the world were focused already on certain areas like social protection, health, general public services, education, economic affairs. And these figures are the figures about government expenditure in terms of percentage of GDP are basically from the OECD. And as you can see in these figures, there are some differences between high income countries to lower middle income countries. Here in this graph, you can see Germany as presented in the dark red bar or column, and then you can see Colombia in the slightly lighter red bar. And you can see the big difference in terms of expenditure on social protection. You can see that a country like Germany allocates almost 20% of its expenditure on social protection versus a country which is more, that falls more in the lower middle income group, like Colombia, spending only 9%. And this is very important because when you look at something like COVID-19, there is a disproportionate effect on countries. On the top, you can see that the population distribution by income level of countries, you can see that already almost half of the population lives in lower middle income countries or low income countries. That means that the protection provided to this population would be typically less than what's provided everywhere else. So understanding that the pandemic is a global thing, the effect is not the same for every country around the world. Already countries were facing key challenges before the start of COVID-19, environmental problems with extreme weather hitting everywhere around the world, technological problems, cyber attacks, also water crises in many areas around the world, geopolitical problems, economic problems, a lot of asset bubbles everywhere, unemployment rising in certain areas. All these things were already there prior to COVID-19. So we also we have tried to analyze the national agendas or priorities of different countries, looking at the national strategies. And we've seen what were the areas that countries were already focused on prior to COVID-19. And some of these were mainly unemployment, looking for new trade deals, better negotiations, and so on, problems of climate change, security. All these were the issues that countries or governments around the world were focused on before the COVID-19 struck. So moving next to our second item on the agenda, which is the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, I will start with the impact on citizens and residents, and later on my colleague Rafi would move to the impact on the industry and businesses. So we have, according to our analysis, we have identified 5 major areas of impact on citizens. Basically, health and safety impact, household economic distress, that's another area. The lifestyle changes that happened as a result of COVID-19, and also the mental health problems arising from the closures and the lockdown in many areas. And the final area of impact is social equity, where there has been a negative impact in this area also as a result of COVID-19 and associated closures and so on. So to begin with, in terms of health and safety panic, I'm sure you all know the numbers. Everybody's following daily the numbers of people infected around the globe, how many now are out of it and how many are still in, and so on. And this is an image that keeps changing all the time. So we know the epicenter started in China, moved to Europe, now to the States and the Americas. And as you can see from the figures, we have now about 6.6 million confirmed cases, with close to half of them in the Americas, a third in Europe, and the rest is all over the globe. And of course, given a month or so, this could change again. But what this really implies is that everybody, citizens around the world, are facing a major threat to their safety and health, and everybody's stressing out about this. So the second area we have is economic distress. As we all know, everybody started their reactions, governments around the world started reactions by limiting movement, limiting work, place the people who should be there, who can work from home, and so on. And this resulted in 94% of workers around the world basically working under some sort of closure or restrictions. This translates into a huge loss or decline in work hours, which was estimated alone for the second quarter of 2020 to reach about 305 million, the equivalent of 305 million full-time jobs. And this is according to the ILO, International Labour Organization. Another important fact also that shows the level of economic distress is that of the additional number of poor people who would be added around the world as a result of COVID-19. The most conservative estimate puts it at 135 million, and that's assuming 5% contraction of per capita income and consumption. The worst case scenario puts it at 580 million people, and this is a huge thing. That means we are regressing so much in terms of fighting global poverty. So this is a major area of impact and a major worry for governments moving on from the COVID-19 pandemic. A third area that we have also identified is that of lifestyle changes. And they're not all bad. Some of them were already out there. We already knew that this was the future, relying more on technology, internet, and so on, whether for work or for schools. So that was going on, but it has accelerated so much as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can see also some trends, fun trends like home cooking is on the rise. Everybody's sharing recipes, cooking at home, even businesses trying to accommodate people who are doing this at home and so on, increasing socializing, people visiting each other up to a limited extent at their houses and so on. So that's also one thing that is happening right now. But the main lifestyle change is affecting students around the world. We have 1.6 billion learners who were affected by university and school closures. And the question we had in the beginning, the small poll, 60% of you already got this. Okay, you knew it was 1.6 billion, while the rest were mainly looking at lower figures. But the fact is, this is huge. This is 90% of the world's student population being stuck at home, learning from home, communicating with their schools, universities, and so on. So another area of impact is that of mental health. And this is a huge problem and a huge worry. Already it was something, one of the challenges that the world was dealing with, but it would probably be magnified after COVID-19. With all the closure, lockdown, people not able to socialize normally, this is going to be a problem. We have here a figure for the people on the front line, also the nurses, the doctors who are fighting this pandemic. In China, a study estimates this to be to have 50% of doctors and nurses suffering from depression due to the things they deal with every day. So this is also going to be something that governments need to deal with in the longer term. Our last area of impact is that of social equity. And of course, we have already posited in the beginning that not all governments around the world are starting from an equal place. So the economic capabilities are different, but even within countries, there are also gender inequalities, income inequalities, racial inequalities in certain areas. So here again, we are having a huge impact. There are already studies that are seeing a large increase in violence, gender violence around the world, with studies in Europe looking at, mentioning that there is a 60% increase in calls by women complaining from violence. And our last point here is basically about children around the world. They're not all afforded the same tools. So you can see that children in lower developed countries, 86% are unable to access online tools for their education, as opposed to only 20% in developed countries. And now I leave you with my colleague Rafi, looking at the impact on businesses and industry. Thank you.
So thank you, Nahla. And as we move on the impact of crisis, next area is to share with you how we see it, the impact on the industry. And we identified 5 major areas that are affecting the industry in context of government's concerns. 1 is severe financial strain. Number 2, supply chain disruption. Number 3, a very focused, significant impact on SMEs, given their significant importance to the economies and livelihoods in countries, uncertainty in the financial markets, and disruption in industrial workforce. I won't spend too much time, but a couple of points to highlight here, and then we'd like to hear from Dr. Syed on a couple of these data points. We've shared your views as well, Dr. Syed. But on this side, you can see, and this is a chart based on data from ILO that highlights sectors that are most affected. And on the right-hand side, you see the proportion of employment by small businesses. So the first 2 blue-colored bars represent essentially enterprises with less than 9 people. So as you can see, the highest impacted sectors have significant portion of SMEs. So we know the impact to them, it's more severe, it's more chronic. Their ability to survive is less than the larger enterprises who have more resources. And in fact, even the stimulus from governments have been more favoring the larger enterprises. The second point is for industries, the United Nations, World Bank have already presented their view where the range of the drop in world trade from anywhere, the least, the best scenario, negative 13% to more likely now scenario around 32%, with North America and Asia hit hardest. Surprisingly, financial markets wise, we see the markets are up, and this is the contradiction where the real economy seems to be disconnected from the financial markets. And that's primarily happening because of the stimulus that governments have provided. But the question remains on the sustainability of even the financial markets' recent rise. So on this, I think most of you got it a little bit wrong. We saw from the answers, it was you said NASDAQ. I think majority of you said NASDAQ was up 20% since March 23rd. In fact, it's up 41%. And the last point in terms of disruption in industrial workforce, we see that about 40 to 50% of manufacturers are facing significant challenges with having employees on the ground, not available, the safety measures they have to put in place. So with this, Dr. Syed, any initial comments on both these data points of impact on citizens as well as the industry?
Thank you, Rafi, and thank you for hosting me in this session. The primary concern that I've had seeing how governments have unfolded their stimulus measures has been the disproportionate impact that it's had on parts of the economy. Across the world, besides a few notable exceptions like Canada and the UK and some European countries and Australia, the majority of government stimulus has been directed towards buffering up the financial markets, which it's done a very good job in. And of course, some direct stimulus measures. In countries even like where they've supported the financial services sector to deploy capital to SMEs and the like, unfortunately, the reality has been is that the funding has not directly been diverted to SMEs because, as you can imagine, institutions like financial institutions, banks, and the like, they of course consider this as a high-risk segment, and given that these institutions may fold because of the crisis, it puts it at a difficult place from a moral hazard perspective to give funding to something that you know that's going to collapse. And that's where the government has to take a more bolder step. I understand, when it comes to supporting this SME sector to reinvent themselves, to kind of sustain this period, to kind of go into kind of switch off mode for a few months. And that's where we've seen the UK has done a very good job with respect to how it supported the SME sector with providing guarantees to financial services institutions to provide that money directly to SMEs directly. And in addition to that, some have gone further out. And I think that's also, I mean, if you think about the key main line items of SMEs, their operating expenditure outside of the cost of goods manufactured or cost of goods sold is their employees and whatever they pay for their fixed costs. And that might be utility bills, that might be a rent. And so if you think about, utilities, rent, and any other expenditure that they continuously have to pay for, what government directives should be focused on is how do you reduce that so that SMEs can kind of sustain for 3 or 4 months. Employees being a big line item. Some of the countries where there is a social contract to provide for employees and there are taxation systems in place for that. Many have done that. In the US, we have the PPP program. And in other countries, they've also provided direct, in Australia as well, they've put the JobKeeper allowance for the period. That said, it hasn't been equal across countries. And as you mentioned, low-income countries are the ones that are really struggling to provide direct aid assistance. And this is where calls for universal basic income have become a lot more louder because, and I think that's, it's really brought it to the forefront. And I think this is something that we should really consider from going forward. And this may be the tipping point for them. That's all I wanted to add.
Great. So thank you, Dr. Syed. And I'd like to remind all our participants or attendees that please post your questions. We'll have a healthy 15, 20 minutes to answer your questions. There's a question and answer button that you all have. So please start posting your questions and we will address them towards the end. The other area, the last area of the impact, and so far we're presenting to you what we have analyzed are the current impact governments are facing. So we talked about, in terms of government stakeholders, the citizens, residents, industry. Now specifically on government functions and services itself. So here, as you can see, we identified 6 key areas impacting government functions and services. Public health and safety, economic recession that it's dealing with, as Dr. Syed alluded to, the stimulus and other measures that they're undertaking, government services disruptions and how governments are delivering their services to all stakeholders, social protection crisis, international trade shifts, and this is speaking to the challenges being faced by the supply chain disruptions, as you saw earlier, that the industries are facing, and the role governments having to play in supporting or addressing some of those challenges. And on a relatively positive side, a trend that's impacting government is, one of the top of mind issues worldwide, which is climate change. So it's a little bit of a silver lining of the opportunity that governments are seeing as a result of this COVID-19 experience. What we are seeing overall, when we look at IMF's projections that they did in October 2019 about the growth, GDP growth of the world, compared to their adjustment of that growth, it's a 7% drop. Now that is the sharpest contraction since the Great Depression in the 1930s. So we are indeed, the word unprecedented is becoming a little bit cliched now, but we are certainly facing, we are in the midst of such times. And what you can see is the impact of that adjustment or further drop as a result of the impact of GDP negatively of post-COVID, how it's affecting different economies in different ways. And from a stimulus point of view, and this was one of the questions, and again, I think majority did not get it right, but so far we have just within G20 countries, over $9 trillion of fiscal stimulus that have been already deployed to support people and industry. Lastly, on this point, and we'll switch after this to the post-COVID our signals assessment. Overall, governments, in terms of their own functions and services, are facing, number one, how do you move from a fiscal stimulus that is really relatively temporary, and how do you create sustainability in their economic response? And second is, how do you deliver the government services, the essential services, and especially the ones that are under stress, social protection, health, general public services, education, and the ones that we're highlighted are the ones that we have derived our signals around. So with this, I will conclude our first section of sharing with you the areas that are impacting governments today. And now we will move to our assessment of the signals that we have identified, the 15 signals. And again, I'd like to remind, please post your questions. We'll go through these signals, and Dr. Syed will give his commentary on each of these that we've analyzed. But before we do that, I'll have Ammar share with you a quick poll. So hopefully we can keep all of you engaged as well. So Ammar. All right. So these set of questions first are around citizen impact. So take a look at it. Quick 2 questions. In terms of how do you rate the level of lifestyle changes caused by pandemic in your country, and the current level of social protection provided government to citizens to weather the pandemic in your country. Dr. Syed, I think these are, obviously we talk about these trends, but not every country is facing these in the same way, right? And I think the responses and social protection, it's also a function of how much resources governments have. Again, governments are dealing with these things in a varied ways. It'll be interesting to see your response. But yeah, if you had any comments on this.
Yeah, and I think what's very exciting is that, and it's interesting, is that some governments have really gone out of their way in an unprecedented manner. In fact, in terms of the funding that's been provided to really enhance the social protection. Now, even in countries like India, I've been impressed with how far the social insurance policies have gone forward. And it goes to this point that I was mentioning before with respect to this heralds a unprecedented move of the role of government. I think the bigger question and the bigger, more philosophical question is what does it mean for the role of government in society? And we haven't had that issue questioned before. Increasingly for the past 70 years, the whole role of government was supposed to stay out of way of humans, of businesses. And now we're seeing that this is actually where humans and citizens are asking for a more active government, and that means getting involved, which means that the social contract may also have to change as a result of that confidence that citizens are providing to governments.
Interesting to see our results here. So our attendees are, I think when it comes to lifestyle changes, majority see yes in their countries. And I think that makes sense given the wide impact the pandemic has had, but a little bit less conservative on the social protection side, right? And I think that perhaps, and we'll be sharing some of our thoughts on this soon. So thank you all for taking this poll. So we will now move to our signals, and I will pass it to my colleague Nahla, who will set the stage for us, and we will together share with you and introduce to you our the 15 signals we've identified.
Okay, so based on our research and analysis, we have identified 15 signals of the new post-COVID new normal. And we have basically segmented these signals according to government functions. So as you can see, we have covered the areas of health, education, social protection, economic affairs, general public services, and environmental protection. I will be covering from signal 1 to 5, health, education, and social protection, and my colleague Rafi will be covering the rest of the signals. So to start with health, of course, one of the new normal signals is that we will have a more capable stress-tested pandemic response health system with both public and private capacity, and also a coordinated government-wide crisis management, because as we have seen with COVID-19, this is an area where there has been a lot of shortcomings. So we need the system to address all these issues, and that is capable of managing pandemics. And here I would like to see if Dr. Saeed would have some commentary on this point.
I think, thank you, Nahla, for requesting commentary. I think one of the interesting points that's really come about from post, I think there will be a pre-2020 and a post-2020 assessment of what crisis management is. And something that we've been talking about, at least as Future Foresight participants, the VUCA world that we're in, right? Everyone's been talking about it theoretically. Some industries have been disproportionately affected by it, disrupted by it to that extent, and crisis has become a norm. I think this is not the first, and certainly not the last time we're going to see continuous, systemic crisis occurring. And if you take the parallel of financial institutions, we encountered this in 2008 during the financial crisis, and where a lot was done to measure the stress testing of financial institutions to weather future crisis. I think what governments need to learn from that experience, for governments in general, is how stress tested are we as a government operating system to be able to have and weather not only pandemics, but a whole lot of other black swans coming our way in the next 10 to 20 years. And for that, we have, I think, certain thinking around what that unit needs to do, thinking around, what we do for fires, right? Fires are emergencies that happen in every building in the world and house. And we have, where there's a lot of people involved, we have fire drills on a continuous basis. And it's essentially the same kind of thinking we need to implement across the board, because in this VUCA world, those crises are going to be recurrent, and we're going to be exposed to them and their fallouts on a continuous basis. And if we're not, those are the governments and entities that are going to lose out.
So our second signal for the new normal is in the area of education, as you have seen and as you have covered earlier with the use of online. we are anticipating an institutionalized flex model of education with the need for licensing and regulation by governments, because there is now an increase in blended learning where you have the use of traditional and online tools as well, and remote and offline systems. So that means that there is need for licensing and regulation, new services on the part of the government in these areas. Also, there is a need for new job placement standards because the world will look different after COVID-19. So we need to adapt to this. And I'm sure also Dr. Said would have something to add on this as well.
This one specifically, I'm particularly passionate about what's happening to education. Before the crisis I was, and having children of my own, and seeing what the challenges have been. I think this has been a boon for a lot of alternative models of education that should have been fairly available before, but have not been. And I think that's the most important boon. I mean, I have witnessed over several years and with a lot of interest, the homeschooling trend that's occurred in places like the United States and elsewhere as well. But we haven't seen it in large parts of the world because it was just a small, dent to the ecosystem. But what this crisis has allowed to happen is what you call a behavioral adjustment that everyone can realize that, well, education is not restricted to bricks and mortar. And that's a transformative move, right? And it's a huge behavioral change. Now, of course, there's challenges with the existing, quarantine schooling, as we call it, not homeschooling, that need to be addressed. But the most important benefit, I guess, and gift that this, I would hate to say it as a COVID, is allowing for alternative models of education to flourish, right? And therefore, not only for K-12, but also for higher education. We have a whole year of students who can't go to university. From next year onwards, even the universities are asking them not to defer for a year. What are they going to do? And how are they going to get jobs? How are they going to get the relevant skills that they need? So, this is a really interesting opportunity to think about how we as government can reconfigure and allow and enable new players to come about that can provide different models of education. We haven't done so. We should have been doing so for the past, 30 odd years, as we've seen that innovation and particularly technology is upended major industries. But really, this is a big cry, a calling cry to the education sector to think about, let's reinvent what we have with respect to how we provide it, how we deliver, and what value we deliver to learners.
And now moving to the area of social protection with two of our signals. We have the problem of mental health that started with the pandemic. So one of the things we're anticipating is the provision of mass-scale mental health support, and for it to become an integral component of insurance, providing assistance to employees, telehealth, awareness campaigns, because as we have seen with the pandemic, this is on the rise and governments need to be proactive in these areas. Another signal is that governments need to specifically address at-risk population segments, the ones who are most vulnerable in terms of being gender inequalities, income and race, education. All this also needs to be addressed. So back again with Dr. Said and what input he can give us on these signals.
I don't want to belabor this point, but what we've seen is across the board, the stresses of this period have led a lot to resort to thinking about their own mental health. Certainly it's had a huge impact on a lot of people, but it's also brought to the fore the fact that we don't have mental health as a support service across many parts of the developing world. Certainly in many parts of the developed world, it's included. And there are provision even for online services, but in many parts of the developing world, the recognition hasn't been there. And I think that's the other behavioral change that's going to be prevalent, and we certainly as governments and entities should be providing for that. And finally, for risk population segments, I'm sure there's been a lot of concern with respect to what occurs with respect to certain population segments, including women at risk, including poorer populations, including labor populations, for instance, and also in terms of education. And certainly one of the things that we've realized that the impact has been disproportionate, and it will continue to be disproportionate for several years. And therefore our response measures should be disproportionate, should be targeted, because certainly, you know, everyone says that COVID affects everyone equally. I don't think that's the case at all. In fact, it's affected certain populations very unequally. And therefore, our focus should be on addressing the needs of those populations.
Okay, so for our last point on social protection, next slide. Okay. So one last point on social protection is basically something that we anticipate is that governments would give more attention or plan more for universal or targeted basic income. Especially we've seen with this pandemic, the people in the informal sector affected to a large extent by the closures. So maybe this is something that we're anticipating that governments would pay more attention to these areas, and also having some kind of talent pool alignment, because as we see, some jobs would not be there after COVID-19 with the rise of automation everywhere. So this is also an important area for governments to cover in post-COVID-19. So Dr. Saeed, do you have also some input on this talent pool alignment?
Yes, I think one of the key things is a lot of the mass layoffs that we've been seeing, and one of the considerations that certainly governments in this part of the world are having is how do you re-engineer and reskill large portions of your population at scale. Certainly, we've seen countries like France and India and others have been doing that through mass-scale reskilling programs, even several years before the crisis. I think it's an important piece of our policy tools to be thinking about how we can do this at scale in the next few years.
Okay, thank you for your input. And now I'm going to move to my colleague Rafiuddin, who's going to cover the rest of the signals. Rafiuddin, to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nahla. So the next category of our signals, and again, as we set these up, these are the ones we feel post-COVID governments will see as a new normal for them. So when it comes to the area of economic affairs, one of the key areas is trade policy realignments. We see the importance of governments making a push towards adjusting or seeking new multilateral, bilateral agreements, especially when it comes to trade. And this is specifically because of the disruptions in the industrial supply chain and trade, which has made maintaining the security of certain essential categories such as food, medical supplies, and even some other areas. And so there is going to be a further shift and realignment, and for government to really prioritize the importance of these agreements. What I'll do is I'll cover, Dr. Syed, the next two signals, and then perhaps you can comment on all three together, and then we have two more. So there are about 5 signals related to economic affairs. So let me cover the first 3. The next one is higher levels of preparedness to support vulnerable industries. So what we have learned from this pandemic's experiences, there are certain sectors that are very vulnerable, as we saw travel, hospitality, food services, etc., have been just strangled. And so the response needed to address those sectors versus others that were relatively okay, food retail, technology, etc., and even some that are thriving. So for these chronic ones, we feel the governments will have to have things prepared already. And this will be part of a post-COVID new normal, where governments will be better prepared to address the most vulnerable industries so they can deploy these solutions faster and reduce the risk of their impact on the country's economy. The 8th signal is something that had already been happening, which is digital transformation. But as all of us know, the pace of acceleration that this post-COVID has done has moved 1 to 2 or 3 year plans into 1 to 2 weeks, and things are being implemented now. And now the question is, how do you make them sustainable once the economies or we go on to a normal? And how do you leverage some of these? Because populations have been forced to experience, and governments have been forced to experience this, and now perhaps these can be further accelerated. So these three signals, Dr. Syed, if you want to comment, trade alignment, preparedness on vulnerable industries, and accelerating digital transformation.
Certainly. I think with trade alignment, one of the interesting things that we've seen is, we know we've been very blessed here that particularly in terms of food and our security, the UAE is ahead in terms of thinking about the strategy for our the security of its core essentials, and therefore we have a food security ministry, etc. And its strategy, which is very novel, is one of which is not to create any enemies with anyone. Number one. Number two, as countries all over the world kind of look inward, is how do you diversify that? And then one of the things that we've seen with some countries who have been at the other end of this, which is very risky, in fact, have, for instance, made enemies with major players in terms of trade. And that's led them to lose potential sources of income. And what that lends itself to is that, given the shifts in the tectonic plates of trade alignments, is how do you create, as a country, be a part of multiple trade agreements and diversify that, but also how you join more multilateral trade agreements, because you don't know when under stress which ones are going to be needed to be activated, and which ones you need to and can rely on to sustain population's growth. On the economic affairs, I think certainly in the UAE, we've witnessed a disproportionate impact on travel, hospitality, and even retail, as we have in many other parts of the world. And particularly these sectors have been hurt, but this lends itself to our thinking that in the long term, you need a very clear crisis management approach to thinking about how we prepare these industries and intervene to support these industries outside of our reactive approach. How do we proactively ensure that we have a way to assess which industries affect our fate in the long term, and how can we protect them by providing stimulus measures directed to those specific industries, which, to be honest, has not been the case. Many countries have created these blanket stimulus measures, which haven't been as directed, other than aviation, and I think aviation was specifically looked at. But certainly other sectors need to be looked at and supported in very surgical ways. With respect to digital transformation, I think that's been talked about. Everyone's experiencing it, everyone's feeling it. I'm not going to go into the details, but I'm sure we'll have some ways of how we can support it in the next session, the next part.
Great. So moving on, the last two in economic affairs. Number one is engaging with and regulating mass technology platform players. Now this might seem a little bit radical, but we identified in our analysis that the major technology players such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and Microsoft are playing actually have significant impact on governments in context of how they're benefiting from population data, generating revenues from it, and governments really don't have any say or any share of that. So we feel one of the signals is that governments will really be looking at how to address, and also from security point of view, data security and others, and taxation point of view, as I said. So this is an interesting one. At least we think that governments, and we see some signs towards this. Next one is enabling new working lifestyle. As stated here, new labor laws, including work from home regulations, best practices for government functions, building enabling systems. So any top of mind thoughts here, Dr. Syed, before we move on?
I think on the first one, certainly, Europe has been ahead of this with a lot of antitrust regulation and also revenue protection mechanisms for what you call the GAFs of the world. And the reality is that most of the other countries have not. So what it lends itself to, and on a more multilateral basis, is how can we create a kind of a digital policy platform that enables smaller countries like the UAE, but also other countries, to start thinking about how we can join or create a movement to regulate how much control these mass technology platform players have on us, the data, and more importantly, also the loss of revenues from the utilization of our citizens' data. With respect to enabling new working lifestyles, I think this has become a real interesting one. Of course, anyone working in a multinational firm, we've been used to this for 20 odd years or so. It's not new, but for many governments around the world that have been operating in the pre-industrial revolution kind of, as the industrial revolution kind of mode for many years, this has been a real hit to their normal operating rhythm. And I think the interesting opportunity is how do we enable that to happen at scale? Because certainly what we've seen in more innovative sectors like technology is not only for technology, but labor laws really need to be able to be flexible to accommodate this. And certainly for governments, our laws need to be shifted to do this en masse and decouple ourselves from the office environment. Certainly not recommending in any way that we decouple ourselves from the office entirely, certainly, but specifically for specific groups and segments, and specifically really thinking about what the future of work is in a flex mode.
Great. Thank you. Now moving to our last two categories, and I'll cover, we have about 4 signals within general public services. The first one is a little bit controversial perhaps, whereby, as you highlighted, Dr. Syed, the role of government, increased role of government in securing economic safety and overall prosperity of countries. So we see a signal where governments need to increase direct investments and partnerships in the economy through PPPs, sovereign wealth funds for sector development, and other such measures. Again, this is nothing new, but I think this COVID and the pandemic has shown the importance of government's involvement, especially in industries that are very vulnerable, and hence build resilience in the economies around this. So that's one. Next, number 12, accelerated automation of government services. So here we're talking specifically about government services. It's a little bit similar to the one we talked about earlier, but it's important to incorporate this when it comes to actual government services as well. Next, number 13, heightened trust building measures with communities. I think one of the realization is where the pandemic has highlighted that getting citizens buy-in to comply with social distancing and other government measures has been a challenge. And so ineffective communication has resulted in people's non-compliance and even, as we know, violent unrest. So this is an important area or signal that also needs to, or we see will be addressed and should be addressed, and we'll talk about those in the action plan. The last one within general public service is stronger international coordination, response policy systems, and implementation. So many governments have realized that countries cannot isolate themselves from economic impact and pandemic proliferation. So the challenges related to such crises necessitate stronger international cooperation. So on these 4, Dr. Syed, if you had any comments?
Certainly we do. I think what would be good is to discuss this en masse with respect to the recommendations. I think you've covered it quite well. And then we can kind of cover the options of what governments have to really solve these issues.
No problem. Sounds good. And the last one, in terms of our signals, before we jump into our proposed action plan and policy areas specifically, is strengthening green standards and climate change impact goals. So as we have seen, this is the silver lining, and the big silver lining, or relatively, is the positive impact on the environment during the shutdowns and the lockdowns and quarantines. And so, given the critical importance of climate change for most governments may put in more effort to sustaining and building on these improvements. And we've seen that already, Dr. Said. You know, some of the stimulus programs from France and some countries actually have linked the stimulus packages to strengthening the sustainability aspect. Okay, so now we will move to our action plan. Before we do that, we will share with you one more poll for you to take. Get your views on a couple of things, and also remind you to please post your questions in the Q&A box. We have a few coming in, but certainly we'll have a good 15 minutes or so to answer your questions. So again, to remind you to post your questions. Meanwhile, here's a quick poll. And this is focused on industry. Does your company have a plan, or I guess, does your institution have a plan for the post-COVID new normal? How do you rate the current level of government support provided to businesses to weather the pandemic in your country? What's your sense, Dr. Said, on how governments are looking at the new normal part? Like, again, we're in crisis management mode, and we're looking to, you know, transition out of this now as the lockdowns are being eased. How much effort are you seeing the governments are putting on planning for post-COVID? You know?
I think I have to say, some of the more developed economies in the world have done a very good job of creating recovery plans. I have to say I was very impressed with what Australia has done as one of the kind of primary ones in terms of the extent and nature of its phased recovery plan and stimulus measures to ensure that the economy comes on board with a boost. Some of the other governments are still in the midst of it, so I'm not sure if they have the capacity and the mental capacity to spare in many parts of the world. And I think that's going to be interesting to see how structured and focused they are in terms of the future.
Great. Okay, so so our participants, 60% of you are saying yes, you're seeing your organizations focusing on new normal. So that's a good sign, right? And how do you rate the current level of government support provided by businesses? I think we have a mixed response, low, medium, high. So perhaps that's an area.
What would be interesting to see is, who stated high and who stated low and which countries they are. That would be interesting.
Absolutely. There's always shades of, segmented responses to get, but thank you all. So now with this, we will jump into our proposed action plan. And again, I know there are some of you have posted a question about the presentation. The presentation, or this actual insights brief, will be available to all those who have registered, and we will be sharing those links. And also later on will be available publicly, but you'll have it first. And we'll be sharing that to you through your emails that you registered. Now, getting into the action plan, our proposed framework is a three-phased framework. Obviously, as governments are starting to look at easing the lockdowns and going into a normality, the reality is no one still knows when this is ending. But there is now more educated assessment and indications that roughly next 6 to 12 months, we should be looking at being able to control this pandemic, because that's the key determinant. As mentioned earlier, our analysis was not looking at current crisis. So looking at 1 year out to 3 years as a post-COVID normal. In terms of the return phase, where governments will have strong contingency plan is in place for future pandemics, or will need to. The enhanced operational SOPs for staff health, virus contamination, etc., and the phased recovery plan. And the next aspect of the framework, which is reforming. So before we actually talk about the policy areas to reinvent the government in terms of thriving post-COVID, we also have to look at how governments will have to reorganize or reform. And that's the second area. And we'll go into details on reform, and Dr. Syed will give us some perspective on how government functions will have to be reformed and other aspects of it. But specifically now, let's share with you, and Dr. Syed will kind of walk through what are, based on all of the analysis we presented earlier, what are the specific areas of policies for governments to consider, specifically relating to, as we see, they're grouped into these 6 government function areas.
Thank you, and thank you for the excellent work being done by DinarStandard to create this. I've only contributed to adding our views in working in government, and that too in a very dynamic government that's been thinking about a lot of these areas. I think a lot of many governments in the world are focused on the return right now, given that it's just the return season just kicked in a week ago. And so a lot of the focus has been on contingency planning, particularly around operating procedures, around staff health in terms of getting people back to work, and kind of ensuring there's a recovery execution, which is the return piece. What has become, and more the dynamic governments have been thinking about, is reforming the entire government operating mechanism and modus. And this is really thinking about 2 major areas of intervention. The first is how you create different units and segments that cater to what will be the new reality or new normal. The second is, and this has an overwhelming thesis around agility. The second is how you become really a digital government. And of course, we've heard about digital government for many years. It's not new, but in this crisis, it's really tested, stress tested what's available for digital government as opposed to what we call or proclaim to be digital government, and still needed physical intervention. And we've seen this in places, in all types of economies all over the world, let alone even the UAE, which is fairly advanced when it comes to digital enablement of government services. I think that the critical focus in here is, what do we reinvent? How do we thrive in this new era? And what are the capabilities that we can enable so that our citizens and our residents can be the happiest they can be? And the government plays this role of protecting them from severe shocks occurring in the future, but also enabling them to enjoy the benefits and so I guess the blessings, the hidden blessings that this crisis has also enabled us to realize. And the first one comes with health, right? In terms of health capacity, there are certain things that more proactive governments have been thinking about for a long time, but it has to do with how we think about pandemic responses. From the United States, who have got a Center for Disease Control and Monitoring, to every country in the world, we have a lot of pandemic response units. But really thinking and stress testing them is going to be critical. But I would argue that beyond that, the more important imperative for governments all around the world, given that this is going to be a sustaining issue across the board, is how do we continue to maintain and have a continuous ongoing unit that assesses this and can deploy all levels of government to join on board to support any of these crises as and when it occurs. On the education side, I think the most important piece in here is for government to think about is, what do we need to support the dramatic change in behavior that we are now witnessing with respect to how students can learn, what's possible of how students can learn, whether that involves homeschooling at one extreme and physical, traditional bricks and mortar schooling in the other extreme, and all the models in between. And allowing for that white space to develop across the board. allowing for that white space to develop across the board means you need to have an agile and open, what you call a sandbox approach to regulation with respect to education. We're very lucky in the UAE and specifically in Dubai that we've allowed that to happen since our Dubai 10X program back 3 years ago with the Rahal program that KHDA has enabled. That certainly allowed us to allow for new types of education licensing to occur, but we need to take that to another level. We need to have 10 or 20 providers and credible ones that can provide alternatives to brick and mortar education. The second thing that needs to occur is also how do we actually provide for flexible education and skills job standards. So, I mean, we've also realized that the skills that are required by in terms of delivering these may not necessarily be the ones that traditional education system promote. And certainly learning and teaching within this new framework has, you need a completely different set of skills than teaching in a traditional classroom. And so what we should be thinking about is, okay, well, what are those new skill sets and how do we enable them to thrive? And how do we enable them to be a part of the new educational system? In terms of social protection, there has been a taboo and certainly a challenge dealing with mental health in many parts of the world. And for many individuals, mental health support has been fairly inaccessible for large parts of the world. I think the most interesting opportunity for us is how do we ensure that employee assistance programs, government policies enable mental health to occur at scale. And in some developed countries, it's included in some insurance plans and the like, but in many parts of the world, mental health hasn't been supported. And I think there is a golden opportunity to really facilitate and enable the happiness of our employees in private sector and government entities, but also beyond that as well. In terms of economic affairs, I think there's been a major shift and it's going to sustain for a while the mass unemployment that has occurred as a result. No matter what kind of boost we provide to the economies, jobs are not going to recover for 2 to 3 years, at least to the level that we've seen. We hope it does with all the stimulus that's going in, but it's certainly not going to come back very quickly. And so therefore, you really need to think about what can we do to address at-risk segments. How do we help them create at least a social safety net, regardless of which country it is? There's a lot of stimulus, but ultimately these populations are at high risk. And there are certain populations that do not have any other sources of income and need direct cash payouts. And we now have the technology to enable that to happen in most parts of the world. The other thing is the reskilling challenge, and we've discussed this, but we really need to think about mass scale reskilling programs. In terms of the new or adjusted trade agreements, we've discussed this, but this diversification play and not relying on even our most reliable trade partners in this new era needs to be a critical pillar of our policy going forward. And I'd want to also mention with respect to technology and technology enablement, one of the things that we've seen, if you go down to what effective governments have done is that they've not solved all the problems themselves, and you can't. As governments, we can't pretend that we can address every issue in the economy and every need of citizens, but what we do need to facilitate is creating an environment or an ecosystem that allows for digital players to come up relatively quickly, service the needs of customers, and keep on trying to address the needs through a market-friendly approach. And some of the more advanced economies in the world have done that really well. In Singapore, just yesterday, they announced a $285 million Singapore package just to focus on the startup and the technology and support them in terms of funding. These are the kinds of forward-thinking initiatives that we need. In terms of public services, I think a very focused intervention with respect to vulnerable sectors need to take place. And this means that governments need to think not as, hands-off policymakers, but as actual interventionists in specific sectors, particularly those that are providing a large segment of employment in the local economy. And that means whether or not it's to do with private and public partnerships or incentivizing public and private partnerships, but it certainly, it cannot be left to private sector players to do it themselves. With respect to digital services, one of the interesting things that we saw before the crisis, and it's been very powerful, and it needs to be a part and parcel of every government in the world, is Estonia's digital rails, right? And I think this is a very powerful use case of where governments can be proactive with respect to how they enable the customer to have control over their data. In Estonia, as long as you've uploaded your content or data, you upload it one time, and then every government entity and even private sector entities can have access to it as and when it's required. We see this in financial services, but it's very rarely seen in other parts of the ecosystem. And what governments really need to think about is how do we enable that to occur across all of the sectors and across the private sector and the public sector. In the UAE, we're lucky that we're slowly transitioning to the UAE Pass, and in Dubai, the blockchain enablement, which will see us also move towards that as well. In terms of the public services, I think one of the things that we realized, not in the UAE, but in many parts of the world, is the level of community trust and confidence that they have in governments. What that's done is that it's actually affected the response, the crisis response. For many governments, they've been unable to control the citizens from listening. And this requires perhaps a disruptive or alternative viewpoint in seeing how you can enhance that community trust. We need to think about what large brands in the world do to enable customers to trust their product, because ultimately you're selling a product that is confidence and trust in your system. And selling that product to the consumers of this confidence and trust, you need to think about the latest means by which they engage with you, whether that's in social media or in influencers that they trust. We need to activate all of them to be a part of our response unit and confidence building measure. And finally, Rafi was mentioning about strengthening international coordination. Going at it alone is certainly not the answer, and the increasing what you call polarization that we're seeing in this discussion is certainly not good for the future, because as we've seen, it actually creates a harder time for smaller countries to play in this, and ones that don't have the capacity. And certainly even large countries, as we've seen, are struggling with this. So this is really a time where you have to play with everyone else in the field. Finally, I think with respect to green standards, we're very lucky in the UAE with respect to already having a proactive green standards regime. But a lot of governments, particularly those at risk of climate change directly, if this wasn't a boon for you, then I don't know what is. But in many parts of the developing world, those particularly exposed to climate change, this is a really interesting opportunity. This is an interesting opportunity to state, okay, well, how much of what we've done until now needed to have been done the way we were, and how much of it can have been done remotely, and then map that out to actually implement what you call wide-scale changes in the mode of working in many industries, to allow, for instance, flexible working in many industries, to reduce or to encourage, through taxation perhaps, the reduction of transportation where it's not required, right? and many other areas of consumption as well. I'd like to move to what we call, in terms of reinventing, what are the kinds of potential actions governments can take to reinventing themselves. And it goes back to our discussion before. Now, proactive governments have had this for a while, but what I think is going to be critical going forward is a health crisis response unit that's elevated at central government level. That works like a emergency department. You have a fire drill department, you have a OHS safety leader. You need to have the same in center of government. And that person should be able to, at a moment's notice, be able to pull together whoever is required from the government to be able to support the crisis response. And this also requires, I mean, I guess from a reform perspective, how do we enable the private sector to play a role in this and enable them to be a part of that response mechanism? That also includes, you know, how do we ensure that digital health? In fact, in Dubai 2 years ago, even before the crisis hit, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum launched Doctor for Every Citizen, which is really a telehealth platform that Dubai Health Authority announced and launched, which enabled, you know, all our citizens to have access to telehealth even before this crisis. But that's not the case in many parts of the world, and that's where, you know, we really think about how do we enable the private sector to come up with telehealth platforms that can allow for citizens, wherever they are, to not need to go to a doctor or to a pharmacy and get their medicines and all emergency requirements delivered to them. With respect to education, I think we've discussed this in fair bit detail. What's really important is how do you create a flexible education regime, and that requires this unit to be built out that enables, maybe it's a new department of flex education that enables new educational institutions to thrive, to enable omni-channel of learning infrastructures to be built, and this certainly cannot be done by your existing regulatory body that looks at bricks and mortars education, simply because the teaching methods here are different. The ways in which you engage with students are different. And therefore your regulatory authority for this needs to also be flexible and cognizant of those differences and be experts in understanding how online education and learning works. With respect to social protection, I think the most important thing is, if we haven't done this, and I know many countries haven't done this, is we need a center of excellence or a mental health unit that enables governments to facilitate the private sector, private players, but also for their own government services to enable mental health services to occur. So every government hospital should have mental health services. Every government unit should be able to provide mental health providers, whether it's through their own providers or through the system. It shouldn't be an exception. It shouldn't be so difficult that it makes it a turnout for individuals to take it on. And that means that we need to enable that to happen. It's become a lot easier now because there's so many more telehealth solution providers out there. They can enable a lot more, even at a very low cost to governments compared to what was available before. Finally, with respect to social protection, given that large portions of the population are suffering from the crisis and are going to lose their jobs, it is very important now that we think, whether that's in the Department of Community Development or the Ministry of Community Development or Community Protection or Social Protection, there has to be the levers and the funding and the ability to deploy mass scale upskilling programs. And those need to be relevant for the new age. Certainly with respect to what we've seen, it's not necessarily that the economies and industries of yore can be supplemented. We need to really enable new jobs to occur, and our governments and our entities need to be able to facilitate that through upskilling programs. In terms of economic affairs, I think what the fundamental transformation that needs to occur is a digital authority. And a digital authority, not in the traditional sense that we enable government entities or government services to be delivered in a digital manner. That's what is a more constricted and narrow definition of the term, but allows for the promotion of economic digitization and digital transformation. I hate to say it, but software is unfortunately eating the world, and every, as our friends at A16Z have mentioned, Anderson Horowitz, and almost every sector that we know of, if it wasn't affected by COVID and economic digital transformation, will in the next 10 years be impacted by digital transformation. What this will allow us to do, of course, is to protect all of these sectors from digital transformation and the effects of being outside of the digital transformation, but also increase our resilience to it. That of course includes that the digital authority focuses on cybersecurity as a strengthened area. With respect to public services, I think what we've mentioned before is now is a time, and I was actually impressed that the government went ahead with setting up its investment arm in this, one of the governments in the region set up the investment arm despite the COVID hitting, is that you need to have a strategic inward-looking investment arm, one that looks at the economy and how we need to enable that to occur here. And that cannot happen from outside. And it's not about investing externally, it's about investing internally in strategic sectors that can enable the economy to grow. Finally, we mentioned the blockchain rails and the customer data-centric platform. I'm not going to mention that more, but certainly the more forward-thinking governments in the world have built this. We need to start thinking about doing this across every country if we are to make our systems more resilient to crisis and also operate regardless of the circumstances. Finally, for environment protection, I think we've done this really well here. We have Ministry of Climate Change and the Environment, but other countries need to really ramp up their game, particularly those at risk, to create a top-level government entity or center of government entity that actually facilitates that to happen and creates those global environment agreements and alliances. I think that covers most of my discussion. Of course, the kind of major trend across all of this is that this requires a reordering of also the financial budget as we've seen that existed before and what needs to be prioritized after. Certainly digital is going to be something that has to be prioritized after. The line item has to be very clear for that, but also certain units here have to be prioritized as part of the financial strategy going forward. If we are, besides what we're of course doing as Nala mentioned in terms of the existing budget, but to facilitate a resilience of the economy regardless of the circumstances outside. I think that concludes most of my discussion. Please, Rafiq, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Syed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for listening and staying on. What we have is we have a bunch of questions that we will try to address in the last few minutes that we have with you. Again, if you don't mind just going on to the question thing and just, there's a feature where you can actually vote existing questions up. So given the short time, we will not be able to address all of them. What we will do is we will certainly take your questions and respond afterwards as well. So with this, we will take some of the questions, and I'm looking at the question pool, Dr. Syed and Nahla. All right, so as you all know, there is, so I'm going to go a little bit by those who have voted the questions up, and as well as some that I'm finding interesting. So the first one is from Iman Ali, and she has a big data challenge question. Says the bigger you are, the more data you have control of. Is I guess a phrase in big data. So big players become a threat to smaller players in terms of innovation. What is the role of government and industry in supporting the small players in leveraging sustainable innovation?
I really love this question. Nada, do you want to answer some of it? And I'd love to answer my percent as well. Perspective as well.
Sorry. So, of course, government needs to play an active role in supporting smaller businesses. And generally speaking, smaller companies have more agility in general than bigger companies in general. So I think going forward, this is one of the important things for government to move on and to support. And then Dr. Syed, maybe you can add more depth into that answer.
Yes, certainly. I think what from my perspective is, I think what do governments need to do to level the playing field, right? And as we've seen, the challenge has been that a lot of these major platforms have played a big role, but there's another way to fix this, and that has to do with how do you enable really a platform government to take place. And what does that mean by a platform enabling government? That means that a government actually supports platforms growing in their local economy. And that needs, of course, there's a data layer, but more importantly, there's a investment layer that needs to take place where local platforms can arise and create new smaller data pools, but not necessarily global ones, that allow for this monopoly to be at least addressed and protected in the local regime. I haven't seen many governments take that approach, but certainly that needs to be a part of the policy longer term.
So I'll give 30 seconds to Dr. Syed Dahla to respond to these questions. We have some very interesting ones. So I want to see if we can get at least a few more in before we wrap up. The next one is from Dr. Muhammad Ali. He says, in GCC, the expats and foreign laborers represent fundamental resources for the countries. Do you think it is time for the GCC governments to improve their social protection for the expats against job loss and underemployment, even for a very short period, like 3 to 6 months, to support them get a new job?
It's a very good point, and there are creative ways of doing this. I think GCC governments would should think through this. Certainly, everywhere in the GCC, particularly. But I think there has to be a creative way of doing this. If you think about the social contract, you come here for a specific job. You are not paying any taxes for that job, other than the financial, other than other government fees, etc. So your social contract is very different to other countries where there are taxes being paid. In contrast, what you can do, and as exists in many parts of the world, you have employment insurance. So what we really need to think about is how do we enable for mass employment insurance to occur in our economies, where maybe the employer and the employee provide a small percentage of their salary, very small percentage, 1 or less than that percent, as a social protection safety net, which then can go into a pool, which then protects these individuals for 6 months or a year. And where governments can support that is by extending the residence visas for a year. To look forward. I think that's certainly something that GCC governments should be thinking about. Yes.
Okay. Moving on from Tayyab Ahmed, will we see more sustainable, ethical, or as we see in our region, Islamic financing modes that are to use in addressing such crises, similar to what we saw in 2008? To build a better global financial architecture. So can you give some examples of where such alternative finance is playing a critical role in government's responses to the COVID-19 fueled economic crisis?
I think Tayyab is in the wrong session. We answered it. Certainly with respect to seeing more sustainable, ethical, I'm not sure if we have, but certainly in terms of ESG funds and the increase of increase in ESG funds, a lot more volume has moved in there recently. I'm not sure if it's going to be a long-term thing. I'm not sure if people are going to be more inclined to it now. But for now, we've seen a lot more interest in it. With respect to, can you give examples of where such alternative finance is playing a critical role in government responses? I don't think they have. and I don't see where they have played a more critical role. I know of some instances where some governments have encouraged funding to be linked to, for instance, green requirements, so that it implicitly supports those green sectors. But by and large, it hasn't, unfortunately. I wish it was, but it's a very good point, and one it's a very good provocation for us as policymakers.
So next, so we're going to wrap up now in a minute or so. So I'll take one more question. This is from Mr. Shahid Usmani. He's saying, don't you think that organizational agility to respond to such crises should also be a major reform initiative that organizations should be looking at, especially in terms of defining the relevant policies, procedures to deploy, and KPIs to establish benchmarks? So I guess he's talking about the organizational agility itself in responding, and that being, you know, I guess the new norm for us to look at.
Absolutely. I think when it comes to reform, and I mentioned this with respect to what you'd, it's a very good point, Shahid. And with respect to reform, I mentioned that agility needs to be a part and parcel of what you call the reform movement across the board. And this is certainly something that we have emphasized here. And you know, in terms of creating the buffer systems that allow for that agility to occur and the switches to occur is going to have to be a critical part of the movement in the long term. And certainly for us, you know, we've been fairly agile, so we haven't had that issue, but I know that a lot of governments in the world are struggling with that. Okay.
All right, so I will wrap up and thank you, and I'll thank you, Dr. Syed, for participating in our insights briefing, both the analysis as well as the presentation. And now I'd like to pass it to my colleague Ammar, who will share with you how you can get the presentation and so forth.
Thank you very much, Rafi, for your time, and thanks a lot for our respective presenters, Dr. Syed and Nahla. That was a great and insightful session. And many thanks to our attendees today for their time and for the great questions they already asked. I would just remind everyone that you will receive a copy of these questions along with the link to the full brief to download later on in a couple of days. Before we conclude the session today, I would like to encourage everyone to kindly participate in the survey that is on your screens now. This will help us to get better, and also it will help us to accommodate your suggestion in our upcoming sessions. Speaking of upcoming sessions, we have one on tourism and hospitality on June 25th, and we have one on social and ethical finance in July 9th. If you want to receive more and regular updates about our live sessions and you know, news about the DinarStandard, please do register in our DinarStandard newsletter. And with that, I would like again to thank everyone.
Ammar, just to the poll is not working, so I think like in the beginning, if we can just reshare it, perhaps.
Yeah, just 1 second. I will reshare it again.
And while Ammar is doing, we look forward to sharing our insights brief and look forward to your questions. We'll be sharing the answers that we were not able to address. So, all right. Thank you, Ammar. Back to you.
Thank you, Rafi. I think it's working now. So thanks a lot for your time again. And we are welcoming your suggestion on this webinar. And please, if you have more questions to ask or any comments, you can email it always to us on the email that you receive on later on with the full link and the questions. Thank you very much. We are looking forward to talk to you in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.